Good morning, 7 East.
Welcome to Thursday, people. It is the 37th episode of LEPRE Radio, back from a day off yesterday where you had 4 other clips to take a look at, looking at reform movements. We are on the air. Short agenda for today because I want to do the entire assignment, kind of, at least read through it. Hopefully that'll help you with the assignment that's being assigned this morning. So first thing, as usual, I'll be making it a regular thing, our weekly calendar and daily countdown. So it should say 37 on today's thing. So you have a new assignment today, How Slavery Divided the Nation. Google Meet at 12:30 to 1. I can answer your questions. Hopefully I have all of the grades for the reform movement stuff and have it sent back. And if you need help, maybe if you need to resubmit it, remember you're allowed to resubmit assignments if you got below a 50 on it, 50 or below. So we could even go over it in the Google Meet if you want to resubmit it, depending on how you did. And then Friday, that Quizlet, I am debating whether or not to make that the last Gimkit of the year because I already have all the questions for Westward Expansion, and I have not made a Quizlet yet for Westward Expansion, and we only have a few days left of it, so I might actually save that for Civil War, but we'll figure that out in the next 24 hours. 26 is the number of the day, because that is the number of days left in the school year, or so I've heard, possibly less, I don't know. But now I'm going to open up the assignment, show you what the assignment looks like. So How Slavery Divided the Nation assignment. I'm trying to keep it kind of consistent. 15 questions, 15 points. And similar to other assignments where you use a slideshow, it's the same thing. There's 15 questions. It's a mix of multiple choice and a mix of short answer. There's also a true-false in there. But the subject is slavery. So in this week that has been about reform movements, you've already learned a little bit about slavery. There was a section on it in the reading. But now we need to look at it in more detail because slavery is the big issue in Unit 8. America is going to have a civil war, mainly over the issue of slavery. And we have to answer the question, how did it get to that point? Well, this slideshow and this assignment is going to help you see how slavery became such a controversial issue and an issue that involved the entire country basically getting into a fight and eventually would spill over into a real war. So we're going to take you through event by event. So first thing in America's history with slavery, we're starting after the formation of the Constitution. So outlawing the international slave trade. Now, to satisfy both pro-slavery and anti-slavery states, various compromises were worked out in Congress between the two sides. First such compromise was over the international slave trade, where the Constitution allowed it to exist for 20 years after its ratification in 1787. International slave trade was then banned in 1807. By that time, there were already millions of slaves in the USA. And they could still be sold inside the states, but slaves could no longer be imported from outside. So you could no longer take a ship, go to Africa, capture slaves, and bring them here. That was not allowed anymore, but you could sell them inside the United States. Free states versus slave states. So this is one of the big developments in the 1800s. The biggest issue over admitting or adding new states to the Union/country in the 1800s was whether they would enter the U.S. as a state where slavery was legal, a slave state, or where slavery was illegal, a free state. Pro-slavery states wanted there to be a balance because they were afraid that if too many states made slavery illegal, then slavery might be abolished by 3/4 of the states in a constitutional amendment. So think back to Unit 5. If 3 out of the 4 states vote to ratify an amendment, it becomes part of the Constitution. So if 3/4 of the states want to end slavery, they can. So the South wants to make sure it's balanced so that there isn't a danger of slavery being outlawed. And this is going to create problems because people who are anti-slavery are not going to like this. Missouri Compromise. So another compromise, 1820. With more people moving west in the early 1800s, remember this is after the Louisiana Purchase, there was an increased demand for territories to be turned into states. In 1820, Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. But that would mean there would be more slave states than free states, which upset people who were anti-slavery. So as a compromise, Missouri would be admitted as a new state along with Maine, breaking off from Massachusetts to become its own free state to keep the balance. So remember, way back when, Massachusetts was actually Massachusetts and Maine were one thing, just called Massachusetts. But to make this compromise, they actually split Massachusetts. You have Massachusetts, and then you have Maine, the detached part. Maine enters as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and it's keeping it balanced. This Missouri Compromise, made in 1820, also said that slavery would only be allowed in future states if they were geographically south of latitude 36 degrees 30. The black line below Missouri on the map separating Missouri from the Arkansas Territory in yellow. So the black line that you see here, that means slavery will only be allowed below that line, not counting Missouri. So after Missouri, any new state that wants to have slavery has to be below this line geographically. Nat Turner's Rebellion. This is a huge thing that happens in 1831, just 11 years after the Missouri Compromise. In 1831, a slave named Nat Turner began a violent revolution among slaves to gain their freedom. Over the course of several days, Turner and fellow escaped slaves freed others and killed their owners, and some of the family members as well. The slaves were eventually defeated and Turner was executed. The rebellion scared the South and led to stricter control over slaves and even worse treatment. So this is kind of one of the signs that this issue of slavery is actually getting to the point where it's going to spill over, not only from slaves rebelling, but also people are going to want to free the slaves and help them rebel as well, as we're going to see later. The Underground Railroad, something that was common throughout the 1800s. The Underground Railroad was a secret system of escape routes for slaves to run away from the South and reach the North. This escape network was run by escaped slaves and abolitionists, people who were against slavery in the North who opposed slavery. The Underground Railroad was hated in the South for helping slaves escape, and slave owners would send slave catchers out to bring slaves back. The fact that Northerners would help the slaves escape further drove North and South apart, as the two sections of the country would continue to get into conflict. But it's important to note, the Underground Railroad is not a real railroad. There are not tracks for it. It's just the word, it's a code name for the system that the slaves would use to escape to the North, secret routes, secret safe houses, ways they could sneak by throughout the South and get to the North in freedom. And if you're a Southerner and a slave owner, you don't like this because you consider the slaves your property, and they're running off and people from the North are helping them, so it makes you mad at the North too. Compromise of 1850, a lot of compromises. When there's a compromise, it means there's two sides that are not getting along. They need to come meet in the middle somehow. So by 1850, California already had enough people for statehood and wanted to enter the Union as a free state. Pro-slavery Southerners did not want to allow this without getting something in return, because it meant that free states would further outnumber slave states. So the number of free states eventually does get off balance. It doesn't get to 3/4 yet, but it's much more than the slave states, because slavery, as you learned in that reading from the other day, it was not something that was useful or popular in most of the country, only the South. The Compromise of 1850 said that California would be allowed to enter the Union as a free state, and that in return, other lands added from the Mexican-American War, meaning the places in brown here, Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory, would be open to slavery, and there would be a stronger fugitive slave law passed to satisfy pro-slavery forces in the South. So basically, this kind of undid part of the Missouri Compromise, because the Utah Territory now would potentially be open to slavery, even though it's north of that line that was set in the Missouri Compromise. Fugitive Slave Law, so this is law that was even strengthened by their Compromise of 1850. One of the hated aspects of slavery by Northerners was the Fugitive Slave Law. This law allowed slave catchers to go north and capture escaped slaves. The law forced Northerners to help the slave catchers and made it illegal to try to stop them. Slaves who were caught and returned faced the threat of being severely punished or even killed when they were brought back to the South. So imagine if you're a Northerner and you're trying to help an escaped slave, you could actually be arrested for this under the Fugitive Slave Law. So if you're an abolitionist and you believe slavery is wrong, helping a slave is a criminal act, apparently. So Northerners were outraged by this. Harriet Beecher Stowe published his Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. So you might not imagine the publishing of a book would make this list, but it is on the list for a reason. So sometimes art can cause a lot of controversy, and author Harriet Beecher Stowe learned this the hard way when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This novel told the story of slaves from the South and opened the eyes of many people in the North to the cruelties of slavery. Southerners and supporters of slavery hated the book, saying it was full of exaggerations and lies to hurt the South. The reaction to the book further divided Americans over slavery, and Stowe actually received a lot of death threats for writing it. So it's an expose showing how cruel slavery can be, and it was a very popular book, and the South hated it because it thought it was misrepresenting them and lying about slavery. But I mean, you can even imagine today how there's movies and books that cause a lot of controversy as well. Certain groups don't like them for whatever reason. The KansasNebraska Act in 1854. So as we get closer to 1860, the events start to become more numerous. In response to even more westward expansion with new territories added after the Mexican-American War, Congress passed the KansasNebraska Act in 1854. The act reversed the Missouri Compromise and now said that slavery would be allowed or not allowed anywhere as long as the people of the territory voted on the issue. This led to pro- and anti-slavery people rushing into the Kansas territory in order to get enough voters to either make slavery legal or illegal. This rush spilled over into attacks and rioting, where many people were hurt and killed in these violent episodes known as Bleeding Kansas. So they basically said, Congress in passing this law, that if you want slavery, you got to vote in favor of it. So both sides were just sending people to the Kansas territory trying to get enough voters to vote for or against slavery. And Kansas eventually does enter the Union as a free state. Formation of the Republican Party in 1854. In 1854, the Republican Party, the modern one, so we're not talking about the Democratic Republicans, we're talking about the modern Republican Party, was formed with one of its founding ideas to be the abolition of slavery in the American territories. So one of their founding party ideals was slavery should be abolished in the territories. The party was pro-business and supporters of Clay's American system, if you remember that, all that stuff about trade, tariffs, and improving transportation. As a result, the party basically got no support from southern states that were based on farming and slave labor. This further divided sections of the country mainly over the party's stance on slavery. So this is kind of early evidence of what we call sectionalism, where one section of the country has its interests and is more loyal to itself. South has no interest, as a section of the country has no interest in the Republican Party at this point. The caning of Charles Sumner, 1856. The violence over the issue of slavery soon spilled into Congress itself. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner gave a fiery anti-slavery speech in the Senate and offended several other senators from the South who were pro-slavery. 2 days later, one of the offended senators, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, went over to Senator Sumner and attacked him, nearly beating him to death with his cane. And you see this picture showing it. This event showed a breakdown of civil debate and discussion, even in government, as violence over the issue of slavery was ramping up. So imagine, this is the Congress. This is the government where laws are made and people are supposed to be civil and write the laws of the country. You have a senator taking his cane, running over to another senator, and beating him nearly to death over the issue of slavery. And it won't be long until we have not just congressmen, but ordinary citizens going at it over the issue of slavery, just like we saw in Bleeding Kansas as well. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. This is a Supreme Court case. So Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri who was taken into free territory by his owner. Since he was in free territory, Scott reasoned he was no longer forced to remain a slave. So wait, if the North has these free states, if I'm there, I should be free, right? That was Scott's argument. When he was brought back to Missouri, he sued for his freedom, but the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, whether free or slaves, were not citizens and didn't have the rights of citizens. The court further ruled that slaves counted as property and did not have constitutional rights. Obviously, this outraged abolitionists and people who were standing up for civil rights for African Americans. And it's just still driving the country further apart, North and South. That's where the wedge is here. And John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So John Brown was a white abolitionist, and he started a slave revolt in the South, attempting to free slaves and fight back against the slave owners. The U.S. Army eventually had to come in and end the revolt when Brown's group tried to get weapons from an army arsenal. Brown was later executed for treason. With Southerners outraged and Northern abolitionists supporting Brown, it further tore at America's unity. So we've seen episodes of slave revolts. The South gets angry about this. They want to crack down on slaves, but Northerners are very sympathetic, saying, why should we blame the slaves for revolting? I'm on their side. They want freedom. Who wouldn't want to fight for freedom? So that's the perspective of Northern abolitionists. But all these events leading up to 1860, they all serve to divide America further and further apart over the issue of slavery. Now, America's going to have an election in 1860, and that's kind of going to be the thing that really drives the country apart, and when the threat of slavery possibly being made illegal is actually becoming very real for the South. So that is the last event in our slideshow. Hopefully me reading along helped you, and you could also just rewind it and take a look at the questions. Every question relates to something on a specific slide. All the information is right in there. There's no trick questions. So you have the assignment for today, and you can work on it tomorrow as well. So that'll be Mr. LEPRE signing off.